Erev Tov. This week's Torah portion is Teitzei, and Moses is continuing almost full speed now with dozens and dozens of laws. His time is coming to an end, and he's got to squeeze in everything to tell the people. And we see many, many laws. And what's fascinating is that there doesn't necessarily seem to be a connection between one and the next many, many times. So the first one is sort of a difficult one, not to understand, but to accept. And it deals with marital and sexual misconduct. So we're in chapter 22, and we read the following, verse 13. A man marries a woman, cohabits with her, he takes an aversion to her, makes up charges against her, and defames her, saying, I married this woman, but when I approached her, I found that she was not a virgin. In such a case, the girl's father and mother shall produce the evidence of the girl's virginity before the elders of the town at the gate, presumably the bloody sheet from their wedding night. And the girl's father shall say to the elders, I gave this man my daughter to wife, but he has taken an aversion to her. So he has made up charges, saying, I did not find your daughter a virgin. But here's the evidence of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread out the cloth before the elders of the town. The elders of that town shall then take the man and flog him. And they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give it to the girl's father, for the man has defamed a virgin in Israel. Moreover, she shall remain his wife. He shall never have the right to divorce her. There are so many things in this passage which bother us and which seem inappropriate. And what I wanted to do was to try to examine what were they thinking back then that they could have come up with such a law and such a procedure. And maybe besides humiliating the young girl is the issue that she can never divorce her husband, that they're stuck forever. What did they have in mind after he pulled this trick on her and went to defame her, which could have cost her her life back in those days. And now his punishment is he can't divorce her. What about her? Why does she get stuck with him? She's an innocent victim in this whole thing. So one of the things that I wanted to examine was what's going on here, and what do each of the parties, what are they thinking, and what's going on? So here's what I'm imagining. Concerning the case of a husband who accused his wife of not being a virgin. So I imagine a female lawyer, could never happen back then, but certainly could happen today. I imagine her name as Noah bat Tzlofchad. You'll remember the 5 daughters of Tzlofchad. And I imagine one of those 5 daughters, these were the girls who stepped forward and said, the laws of inheritance are unfair. There's no son, and the daughters can't inherit from their father. That's not right. So I imagine one of these daughters becoming a lawyer and speaking up in this case. And she says, Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to present an amicus brief representing the views of many women and all fair-minded people. What are the facts of the case? Number 1, the husband hates his wife. And we see that in verse 13. He takes an aversion to her. Number 2, he defamed her reputation by claiming she was not a virgin. We saw that in 14. Number 3, the wife and her parents have the physical evidence that she was a virgin. That's in verse 15. Number 4, the fact that the husband doesn't know that such evidence exists means that he is either very stupid or extremely rash. I mean, to make this kind of charge when there is this physical evidence, and for him to be oblivious of that, either he's very stupid or he is incredibly angry about something. Number 5, a very intimate personal matter has regrettably now been made into a public spectacle, with her bed sheets and her vaginal blood put on display for everyone to see. Very distasteful for us to read this procedure. Number 6, in truth, the presence or lack thereof of blood after first intercourse is not a reliable proof of virginity. Medical authorities will substantiate this claim. Today we know that. Today there are medical authorities who can tell you that. Not sure there were 3,200 years ago. Number 7, though she is a married woman, the wife has now been reduced again to her father's silent daughter. Number 8, the husband has been publicly flogged, humiliating him and giving him further reason to resent and hate his wife. Number 9, the husband is forced to pay his father-in-law the sum of 100 shekels of silver. Number 10, the woman is to remain the man's wife. He may never divorce her. And that's in verse 19. And then 11, the implications of this case is, it is better for a woman to be married to a stupid or rash man who hates her rather than be divorced and on her own. And then Noah bat Slavchad, after stating brilliantly all the facts of the case, concludes and summarizes, I ask the court to strike down this law. And I think we all would agree that what Noah is saying here, we're with her, 100%. But we need to try to understand what was going on from the point of view of back then. So now we have the father of the young girl who comes forward. And after Noah makes her case, he says, Your Honor, the law in this case is a good one, meaning that they flogged his son-in-law, and his daughter has to remain married to this jerk. The law in this case is a good one. First, the requirement about proof of virginity is a way to warn our Israelite girls that they must not engage in sex before marriage. So, here's from the father's point of view, how do we keep our girls pure, right? And having to prove after the wedding night, her status, he feels is a good thing, because the girls don't want to get in trouble and be publicly humiliated if the husband finds out that there is no proof of their virginity. Father continues. Second, it protects the father. If the husband would be able to divorce his wife in this case, the father would be left with the financial burden of supporting his daughter. And then who would look after her once he's gone? Of course, in rabbinic law, that's the whole point of the ketubah, that there was money set aside from the husband's estate, so that if there is a divorce, the divorced wife could collect that money, and there would be somebody to take care of her, that money. Whereas if before the ketubah existed, probably in biblical times, ultimately she had to go back to her father. A woman in those days couldn't hold down a job, couldn't earn a salary. She had nothing. So the father now had to take her back and had to provide for her. The flogging and the fine will teach the husband a good lesson. I don't think we'll have any more problems from him. I say, keep the law the way it is. Okay, so we're trying to understand this whole position from the point of view of the father, whose main concern, of course, is financial. It's going to cost him. He doesn't want to have to pay or have to take care of this daughter if she's divorced. So the father is all in favor of the law here. And then after we hear from the lawyer, after we hear from the father, sort of as a afterthought, we have the poor woman herself, who says, almost in a whisper, talking to herself, why is it that no one has asked my opinion or is interested in what I want? Right? To me, very powerful words that, we're looking after the father and his financial stake in the whole matter, and we don't really care about the stupid or rash husband. He will be forced to do what's in the interest of the father. But nobody says to the young woman, what do you want? What would be your desire in this case? Do you want to stay with this guy, or do you want a clean break? And ultimately, when the rabbis come along in rabbinic Judaism with the Mishnah and with the Talmud, the woman will have some say, and that will be part of Jewish tradition. But it was going to take 1,000 years until we got to that particular place. So that's our first piece. Then if we look in chapter 23 of the book of Deuteronomy, this one I want to call Letters to the Editor. So I'm imagining that there was a reader of the Torah. Now, clearly Moses is writing it at this time. So I'm imagining it's going to be a little bit later when there actually is a scroll or a book for somebody to read. And I'm imagining this is a reaction to reading chapter 23. So we start with, Dear Sir, I write to express my unhappiness. Disgust might be a better word, with some of the elements found in chapter 23 of Deuteronomy. You start off with laws about marrying one's stepmother, and then quickly graduate to crushed testicles and a cut-off member. Soon we come to nocturnal emissions and the proper way to defecate. We then include laws about female and male cult prostitutes. I turn to the Bible in order to escape the coarse things in life, not to have them flung in my face. I was hoping to find more of love thy neighbor as thyself, and honor thy father and mother, not filth about filth. Reading from the good book is something that I want to do with my children. Obviously, with chapters like this one, I can't. disappointed in Dibon Gad, the name of one of the local towns. So chapter 23 brings us all these issues, and we can imagine somebody saying, ew, what's going on here? And you would also imagine that in Hebrew school, this is one of the chapters that they probably had to skip. So this reader writes to the editor, I'm not very pleased. What's going on here? So the editor needs to explain himself and perhaps explain the book. So this is what the editor writes to Disappointed. Dear Disappointed, to some people, the Bible and religion in general is a refuge from the real world. As such, when they turn to the book or to the tabernacle, they expect to find ideal life, paradise on earth. But there's another view of tradition. It's not a place we run away to. It's something we bring with us to life as it is. It's a guide to right and wrong. Therefore, it needs to talk about the good, but to also confront and tackle the bad and the ugly. With such a guide, it is then our responsibility to try and change the world for the better. Chapter 23 contains a mix of both sections. We see, for example, laws about treating our former enemies, the Edomites and the Egyptians, civilly. Laws about not charging interest to fellow Israelites who need a loan. The importance of fulfilling vows and promises. And the law not to turn over an escaped slave to his master. Yes, Israelite religion deals with how to defecate. Of course, his reference is that there's a section where we're taught that soldiers in the camp needed to have a kind of a spike on the end of their weapons so that when they went to defecate, they had to dig a hole first, almost like a cat, and do it in the hole and then cover it up, as opposed to thousands and thousands of soldiers just doing their thing wherever and anywhere and everywhere you walked. There would be the results of that. So one of the things that this chapter teaches is about sanitary cleanliness and hygiene. Then, because religion is not simply something we do for an hour on a Shabbat morning, it is how we live our lives 24 hours a day, every single day of the year. You can't be a holy person when you come to the temple and then urinate and defecate in front of somebody else's tent. Some of the Bible is for children. Some of it is not. We hope that you will find the appropriate passages to share with your child now, and that child will grow up to eventually read all that the Bible offers. So, that's one man's opinion of unseemly things that we find in the Torah, and then a kind of a defense of why the Torah deals with such things in the first place. So we move to chapter 24, and we read the following. In verse 5, chapter 24, we're on page 1128, you see the following. When a man takes a bride, he shall not go out with the army or be assigned to it for any purpose. He shall be exempt 1 year for the sake of his household, to give happiness to the woman he has married. So we saw this a couple of weeks ago in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 7, right? Careful readers will note that Moses previously had said, just 4 chapters ago, the following. Then the officials shall address the troops as follows. Is there anyone who has paid the bride price for a wife, but who has not yet married her? In other words, somebody who has betrothed, or what today we would call who is engaged, but they are not yet married. And we find out, let him go back to his home, lest he die in battle, and another marry her. So that's what Moses said just 4 chapters ago. You got a guy, he's engaged, he's given a deferment for a year so he can marry the girl because the tragedy could occur, he could die in battle, and then though engaged, they were never married. So people who were careful readers say, wait a minute, you just told us this in chapter 20. Why are you repeating this in chapter 24? And you're not exactly telling it the same way. Okay? So people wanted to know, how do we account for the repetition of subject and the subtle differences in language? So there are several possible answers to explain why Moses repeats himself in 20 and then in 24. Here's the legalistic explanation. Deuteronomy 24 deals with a case of a man who is already married. Deuteronomy 20 concerns a man who has only betrothed a woman but is not yet married and begun living with her. Okay, so 24 is a slightly different case. It's in the same ballpark, but the previous one, you just got married, you get time to spend with your wife. 24 is they're engaged but not even yet married. So Moses comes 4 chapters later to add this detail which wasn't covered in the first one. So that's the legalistic explanation. How about the financial explanation? The concern of Deuteronomy 20 is that the man has paid the bride price but will not enjoy the benefits of his monetary expenditures. Deuteronomy sees a bigger picture beyond economics. So 24, right, goes beyond just the money. How about the public relations explanation? It was not wise to plant the seed in soldiers' minds before battle that they might die. The later version removes that language. Remember in 20, let him go back to his home lest he die in battle. On second thought, Moses thinks to himself, maybe that's not a good thing to tell people. Let me rewrite the law so that it leaves that out. I don't want to have people scared of before they go into battle. How about the time frame explanation? Deuteronomy 20 is open-ended. One could make the case that after going home and marrying the betrothed woman, the man doesn't have to report at all for military service. Deuteronomy 24 closes this loophole by limiting the exemption to 1 year. And again, Moses maybe wasn't very careful. And in the first case, in chapter 20, maybe, I just got married, which means I don't ever have to serve. And now we know in chapter 24 that that's for a limited period of time. How about this one? The dementia explanation. Moses is just old and forgetful. He didn't remember that he'd already addressed the same issue just 4 chapters earlier. There's no rhyme or reason for the different versions. And finally, the humanistic explanation. Deuteronomy 24 was possibly written by or with the inspiration of a woman. It's all about a husband giving happiness to his wife for a significant time. And again, listen to verse 5 in chapter 24. When a man has taken a bride, he shall not go out with the army or be assigned to it for any purpose. He shall be exempt for 1 year for the sake of his household, to give happiness to the woman he has married. Right? And the question is, would a man have considered that? Or, would the man basically think about, well, I paid money and I'm not going to be able to get the enjoyment out of having a wife, so I'm sort of rooked out of my financial expenditure. Would the man have been told, your obligation is to make sure your wife is happy? Today, we'd like to think that that would be the sensibilities of, woke men. But the idea is 3,000 years ago, maybe not. So here's a fascinating idea that maybe chapter 24 was edited, rewritten, touched up by a woman's hand who looked at it from the point of view of the woman and not just from the point of view of the army or of the nation or of the man and his bank account. So that's from chapter 24. So we come to the Haftorah for Teitzei, and that begins on page 1138 in the Chumash. We're in the book of Isaiah. Remember, this is the 5th Haftorah in the cycle of 7 weeks, taking us from Tisha B'Av, 9th day of Av, to Rosh Hashanah. And each Shabbos for 7 weeks, we read a passage from the book of 2nd Isaiah. Remember, 2nd Isaiah, everything from chapter 40 to the end, 66. And this collection is different than the first 39 chapters of Isaiah, which were written perhaps 200 years earlier. This Isaiah, called often 2nd Isaiah, even though all of the chapters are in the same book, you wouldn't necessarily know there were 2 different prophets by the same name. 2nd Isaiah comes to the people in Babylonia, in exile, after the destruction of the temple. Maybe he's around the year 550 BCE. And his message after the destruction in 586 is, don't give up hope, don't be despondent, God will return us, God will help us rebuild the temple. So that's the background, and all 7 weeks, as we deal with destruction, until we come to Rosh Hashanah, and new beginnings is, in a sense, about comfort and consolation, which is why these Haftorahs are called Haftarah de Nechemta. Nechemta, same word as Nechama, which means console or comfort. And you may remember a couple of weeks ago, the first Haftorah in the cycle was Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, my people, be comforted. So that's the first point I want to make. Second point is, remember, all along my insight to Haftorahs in general is that the language is very, it's high literature. And most of us don't really get it, either because it's written on a high level poetry, or because we don't get the historical context. And as I've said over and over again, one of the craziest things is that this has become, the reciting of a Haftorah has become the main thing that distinguishes a bar and bat mitzvah. They certainly, those kids at 13, are not going to get the poetry. Many of us adults have difficult with it. And they're certainly not aware of the history. So what seems to me is that to understand not just this Haftorah or this cycle of Haftorah, but all of them, is we need to see the prophet as, in the prophecies as street theater. It wasn't so much what he said, it was what he did. It was the play, the skit that he put on before a group that he gathered in order to teach them an important lesson. So here's my understanding of this Haftorah. The prophet rode into the town square on a small cart pulled by a donkey. On the back were construction materials, tools, ropes, canvas, pegs. He parked his cart and tied the donkey's bridle to a post so it wouldn't move on. Passers-by watched, puzzled by the sight. And of course, my take is that Isaiah is doing this to attract a crowd. You know what? Just to get up on a soapbox and give a speech, you're not going to grab their attention. But if you put on a little show, people want to know, what is this? What's this about? What's he trying to tell us? And the prophet says, I'm looking for the widow. Where does she live? He asked. Which widow are you talking about? People wanted to know. The one without any children. I'm here to make her tent much bigger. So imagine people living in tents. Imagine a single woman who lives in a small tent. Why would you want to make the tent bigger? Back in the day, when people did reside in tents, the only reason you'd want to enlarge the tent is if there were children that were going to be coming in to the household. You got a studio apartment, and now you have the first baby, it's going to be real tight. So you put on an extension, or you're going to have to move to a bigger place with a nursery. Why would a childless widow need a bigger tent? She has no husband and has no kids. It's just her. She's all alone. The prophet smiled at the question, and he climbed up onto the cart. So the cart now becomes his stage. A husband is coming to make her his wife, and she will give birth to more children than any of her neighbors have. I was sent to enlarge the size of her home, to the right and to the left. In other words, it's not just we're putting an extension on to the back. You're going to need a room here, you're going to need a room there. She's going to be remarried, and she's going to have not just one child, not just two, perhaps many, many more kids, more than any of her neighbors. People are scratching their heads. What woman are you talking about? And why did God send a prophet to tell us, first of all, to put an extension on a widow's tent? And why did God send the prophet, to bring this message to this particular woman? So the people don't get it, and they say, what did you say the name of this barren widow was? And now that's the setup, right? Now comes the punchline. And Isaiah says, the name of the barren widow, Israel. And Adonai Tzivaot is coming to betroth her. So now it becomes clear, we're not talking about a real woman. We're not talking about a widow. The Jewish people are the widow. How are they the widow? Because in a sense, they've been left alone and grieving, bereaved, after the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, a couple of decades before. And of course, Isaiah is playing off of this beautiful metaphor that God is the husband and the Jewish people are the wife. Many of the prophets use this same idea. Jeremiah did it, and Hosea did it as well. That God is the husband and Israel is the bride. And there's this intimate relationship between God and the Jewish people, akin to a marriage. Okay? And so now we have the following. Adonai Tzivaot is coming to betroth her. Shout aloud for joy. The day will come when she, the Jewish people, will no longer remember her widowhood, the destruction, the Holocaust that took place. Her children will one day dispossess all those who made her once so forlorn. Suddenly it began to drizzle, and then rain, and finally to pour. The people in the town square ran for shelter, but the prophet stood on the back of the cart, his hands stretched out, his face looking up to the sky, as he was quickly drenched. This is like the rain in the days of Noah. But just as God swore then that he would never destroy the world again, so now God is promising never again to destroy or abandon his people. This is his covenant of peace. So says God, who loves us. So we get, in the Haftorah, in verse 9, it says as follows. For this to me, this is God talking, this meaning we're in exile, the Jewish people are in exile. For this to me is like the waters of Noah. As I swore that the waters of Noah nevermore would flood the earth, so I, God, swear that I will not be angry with you or rebuke you. So, here, the way that the Haftorah is written, it seems to come out of nowhere, which is why I imagine that in this little street theater, it doesn't go the way the prophet wanted it to. He was hoping to put on this little skit, and the people would say, that's beautiful, we love it. But all of a sudden, it starts to pour in the middle of his skit, and he loses his audience. And he's got to think quickly. And he's very good at thinking on his feet. And he says, remember the story of Noah? Just as God was angry at the world and wiped out the world, but then promised Noah, I'll never do this again. So too, in our time, Isaiah is telling the people, God was angry at the Jews, not at the whole world. He, instead of a flood, he wiped them out with an enemy, the Babylonians. But now, just like with Noah and the rainbow, God swears, I will never again do this to my people. So that becomes the message. And so to me, it's suddenly raining. That's nowhere in this particular speech. But I imagine it coming out of the way things work. Sometimes an actor's got to improvise on the spot to deal with what's happening in the theater with a member of the audience. You know, when you change the performance to deal with what's going on. By the way, this Haftorah, one of the only Haftorahs that is chanted twice during the year. Here it's chanted as part of the cycle of 7 Haftorahs for reasons that we've just seen. But if you can guess, what would be the other week that we would always recite this? And of course the answer is Noah. The second Torah portion of the year, Breshit, and then Noach, right? The idea of, because it says, this to me is like the waters of Noah. As I swore that the waters of Noah nevermore would flood the earth, so I swear that I will not be angry with you or rebuke you. So we read this during that week. We read it again during this week. Twice, same Haftorah. So that's the Haftarah for Teitzei, and we'll take a little break, and at 8:30, Cantor will lead us in the Mariv.